Какая бригада?
80-я.
Мобилизованные?
За что?
Это что такое?
Тюрьмы.
О, заебись, по какой статье сидел?
152.
И что такое?
Зґвалтування.
Еще раз.
Зґвалтування.
По-русски.
И изнасилование.
Охуенно, блядь. Так, а остальные?
Похож.
Че, блядь, все за изнасилование, блядь? Охуенно, блядь. Целое петушиное, блядь, отделение отправили. Ну, блядь, я понятно, хули вы именно в Курск отправишь. Мы вас здесь всех не распи***ли, блядь, блядь. Наверное, украинцы даже, блядь, спасибо вам скажет, блядь, за то, что мы вас
Пошли.
The situation for the Ukrainian defenders across the entire front line, from Kursk to Kupyansk and in the south on the Ugledar front, remains difficult and for the most part negative. Russia continues its recent surge of progress in its counterattack in the Kursk region, which was revived since October 10th and is threatening to cut off the main supply routes of the Ukrainian armed forces there. Western media outlets like CNN and BBC choose to remain silent amidst this debacle for Ukraine and instead publish curious articles like this one, dated the 12th of October, entitled "The Kursk Operation Has Been Normalized," and goes as far as to accuse, quite ironically I say, Russian President Vladimir Putin of trying to downplay it. And here's a passage from CNN citing a Ukrainian commander inside Kursk. Russian advances are mostly happening on the flanks of our foothold. They keep trying to advance, but the gains are incremental. This propaganda is to be contrasted by other Western outlets such as the UK's Daily Telegraph, as well as the Newsweek newspaper. Newsweek admitted on October 15th that the Kursk map shows that Russia regained nearly a quarter of lost territory, admitting that, and I quote, Russian forces have continued their counter-offensive in the region for the fifth consecutive day and have recaptured 46 square miles, according to Ukrainian open-source intelligence telegram channel Deep State. And for those of you who caught my last video update on Kursk, you would note that when that video was published 4 days ago, the progress had been 38 square kilometers, or 14.7 square miles, for the Russians. The Daily Telegraph, a UK newspaper, went further, also on the 15th of October, in their headline entitled, "Russia retakes half of lost Kursk territory." And here's an even better quote. Mr. Zelensky has insisted that the situation has stabilized, but the US-based Institute for the Study of War, which holds, and I quote, staunchly pro-Ukraine views, said that it has seen visual evidence that Russia has recaptured 46% of its territory in Kursk. I suppose we can swap Mr. Zelensky for CNN in that last quote, and it would have the same propagandistic effect. One can only assume that CNN's refusal to report on the loss of territory in Kursk is because of the upcoming US elections that are scheduled in less than 3 weeks, and which shows the Democrat candidate Kamala Harris is losing ground in the polls, and perhaps almost as rapidly as Ukraine is losing ground in Kursk.
US Vice President Kamala Harris has been on a media blitz since October began. However, a move that was meant to make Harris more familiar as a candidate among undecided voters has backfired, putting her presidential race in jeopardy.
Maybe the left-wing media establishment in the United States, who in my opinion have remained biased towards the Harris campaign, do not want to burden her election prospects with more bad news from the Ukraine war, a war which she does not intend to stop. Russian mill blogger by the name of Boris Rosin shed some insight as to why the Russians have waited this long to launch this counterattack in earnest to deal with the Ukrainian Kursk invasion. As reported in Newsweek, he said that the muddy season has started and that the Russian reliance on tracked vehicles gives them an advantage over Ukrainian wheeled vehicles. The ISW also said that the muddy season was, in quotations, probably a factor in Moscow's decision to intensify attacks in Kursk. And lastly, a soldier from Ukraine's Adar battalion, Stanislav Bonatov, said that the bad weather was, and I quote, interfering with the operations of drones and military equipment. Meanwhile, further south, recent Russian advances show gains amounting to between 3 to 4 square kilometers in the directions of Velika Novoselka and the Zaporizhia region toward the villages of Levadna and Novodarivka. So in today's video, I will cover the Kursk, Kupyansk, Kursk, Kurakhove, and Ugledar fronts. And in summary, there's simply no good news for Ukraine on any of these frontline sectors. The best information probably comes from the Kursk front, as the Ukrainian defenders have generally been able to hold the line for the past week. The worst situation, however, remains in Kursk, and that is where I will start today's update and finish off with the Russian movements in the south. So let's get into it. For the third consecutive week, the Russian armed forces have been conducting an offensive in the Kursk region, where they have deployed 50,000 troops. In some areas, it is now being reported that the ratio of Ukrainian troops in confrontation with Russian forces reaches 1 to 10. As a result, this is currently the only section of the front where the Ukrainian armed forces are engaged in maneuver warfare rather than establishing a static front line. Thus, the battlefield is highly dynamic and the mapping of the fighting is somewhat conditional and not always precise. This situation, according to Ukrainian media, presents both advantages and disadvantages to the Ukrainian army. On one hand, Ukrainian soldiers can safely retreat into the forests from specific settlements. On the other hand, it necessitates a high level of coordination. If coordination is poor, Russian forces can unexpectedly target Ukraine's rear units. Consequently, drone pilots have had to engage in close combat near the village of Zeleni Shylakh. In fact, according to Medusa, the villages of Zeleni Shylakh and Novoivanivka are the most important nodes of the Ukrainian defense to block the Russian approach to Sudzha. If those villages fall and the Russians are able to advance toward Malaya Lochnia, Russian troops will cut off the entire northwestern part of the bridgehead of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Kursk region. So far, however, Ukrainian reports suggest that Novoivanivka has not been taken and the Ukrainian command refuses to withdraw troops from the threat of encirclement. What has been confirmed for days now, however, is the Russian capture of Lyubimovka, as well as their ability to now cut off the main supply route for the Ukrainian armed forces, that is, the Kurakhove-Sudzha highway. To this end, Russia has concentrated most of its efforts to strike eastward from Kurakhove to take control of the road running from Sudzha. The main idea behind Russia's offensive was to cut off the northern part of the Ukrainian army, which was stuck in the fighting near Kurakhove, and further north towards Lvov, from the southern part, which was based around Sudzha. If this plan had succeeded, the northern grouping of the Ukrainian defense forces would have been left without logistical support and at risk of encirclement. To this end, the Russian armed forces first attacked Lyubimovka and, having succeeded, developed an offensive on Zeleni Shylakh, Novoivanivka, and Leonidovo. Ukrainian troops first retreated and then hit Russian flanks from the north and the south. As a result, some positions south of Lyubimovka and near Novoivanivka were recaptured by Ukraine. Currently, fighting continues in the area of Zeleni Shylakh and Lyubimovka. Near Olgovka, the Russians claim to have surrounded 1,500 Ukrainian troops. This group of Ukrainians defending these positions was supposed to develop an offensive in the direction of the Lvov-Rilsk road in the depths of the Kursk region, but were forced to remain on the defensive. Whether or not those troops were destroyed in the encirclement has not yet been confirmed. The Ukrainian armed forces, however, have seemed to be able to regroup and restore some logistics and positions in the area of the front. However, the Russians managed to unblock their units that were surrounded near Kremin. Trends on this section of the front are such that Russia is trying to get as far east as possible, but constantly encounters Ukrainian ambushes and local counterattacks. Nevertheless, if the Russians managed to cut not only the road from Sudzha to Kurakhove, but also from Sudzha to Lvov, for example in the area of Malaya Lochnia, the Ukrainian armed forces would be forced to curtail or reformat the entire northern front. Although this is not yet the case, the situation remains fluid and is changing every day. Further to the east of the Kursk Bulge, the Russian armed forces continue to successfully storm Kurakhove, Ruskaya Konopelka, and Nakaev. The Ukrainian defense forces have slightly retreated from the area of Kyryvka and Kauchuk. On the western front of the Kursk region, Russian forces have pushed Ukrainian troops back south of Rushovko and are advancing on Ukrainian positions near Veseloye in the direction of Sukhinovka. As we shift further to the south in Ukrainian territory, another perilous situation is developing for Ukraine on the Kupyansk front.
Візьміть необхідні речі, повідомте сусідів, перехожих та знайомих про загальну евакуацію. Також хочемо наголосити, що робота критичної інфраструктури в зв'язку з критичними пошкодженнями комунікацій, а саме газопостачання, водопостачання, електропостачання, неможливо відновити у вашому населеному пункті. Тому закликаємо вас до наступу холодів евакуюватися в більш безпечні регіони. Ви можете телефонувати за номером гарячої лінії з питань евакуації 0800 33 92 91.
Ukrainian media reports that the first wake-up call for Kupyansk came with the unexpected breakthrough by Russian troops through the forests west of Senkivka, reaching the outskirts of Petropavlivka. Although a Ukrainian counterattack forced the Russians back to their original positions, the incident remains alarming. Over the past few months, the Ukrainian armed forces have lost several positions in the Senkivka area, allowing Russia to inch closer to Kupyansk, which has been enduring FAB bomb attacks for more than a year. To the south of the city, Russian troops advanced several hundred meters more in a week and reached the outskirts of Kyryvka. The northern part of the village has already fallen into the grey zone, and Russians have less than 1 kilometer to go before reaching the Oskil River bank. And probably on the most key area of the front, the Kurakhove sector, not much has occurred in the past week. After the Russian armed forces managed to force the Kyryvka River north of Hrodeka, they completed the occupation of Krasny and Kruty Yar as well as Mykolaiivka. Russia has created an opportunity to attack Myrnohad. As a result, the Ukrainian defense forces are already forced to repel the first attacks on the outskirts of Myrnohad, in particular the village of Promin. Despite Russia's attempts to break through Selidove, Ukrainian soldiers managed to repel all attacks. The Russians continue their attempts to bypass the town from the north and Novoivanivka, and from the south from Sukhorin. In Sukhorin itself, the Ukrainian armed forces still hold positions in the western part of the town, but the situation is rather uncertain and tends to deteriorate. From Sukhorin, the Russian army is storming both to the west and to the south, where it has already expanded the grey zone to the outskirts of Izmailivka. On the south of the Pokrovsk salient, where the Ukrainian headquarters of the Southern Donbass forces sits, Russian forces have nearly captured the village of Hostre and have broken through to the village of Ostrovsky, which puts them at just 1 kilometer away from Kurakhove. Urban fighting is likely to start soon if Russian troops attempt to storm Kurakhove from this less favorable direction. However, they are more likely to move south to encircle the defenders in Maximilianivka and then launch an offensive on Kurakhove from the east. Despite this, the front line in Maximilianivka itself has remained unchanged for several weeks. To the south of Kurakhove, Russia made a kilometer-long advance near Katarinivka. Fighting broke out in the eastern part of the village. Russian troops also managed to move the front line even further to Bohoyavlenka, moving from both Ugledar and Vodian. At the same time, from Preshestivka towards Novoivanivka, the Ukrainian Defense Forces managed to stabilize the front line and prevent any territorial changes. However, the Russians focused most of their efforts on advancing toward Velika Novoselka, which is undoubtedly the last Ukrainian-held bastion in the southern part of the Donetsk front. Now, after occupying Zolotaya Niva, the Russians have expanded its zone of control by 3.5 kilometers from east to west and 4 kilometers from south to north. In the future, they plan to advance between Kashalak and Shaitanka rivers until they come close to storming Velika Novoselka. At the same time, the Russians are putting pressure on Ukrainian defenders near Kyryvka and have also activated their left flank, where they have expanded their control zone near Prurutny by 4 square kilometers. From here, the Russians will try to break through to Levadna and Novodarivka, which were liberated by the Ukrainian armed forces last summer. So far, in 2 days, the Russian armed forces have moved 4 kilometers to the west and started fighting for Levadna. It seems that the Ukrainian Defense Forces were not ready to stop the Russian troops in this area.